Welcome back. Clearly, technology is a big part of being successful with the implementation of CMMC. Our next session is headlined by Richard Wakeman. Mr. Wakeman is the Senior Director of Aerospace Defense for Azure Global Engineering for Microsoft, and Carl Herberger, Vice President of Security Services at Cybersecurity. They're here for a detailed discussion of exactly how something most of us already own, that's Microsoft, can go a long way to getting you compliant with CMMC.
Good afternoon. This is Carl Herberger with Cybersecurity. I'm here with Richard Wakeman from Microsoft. And today's whole discussion this afternoon is about the technology spotlight and how technology can both be a hindrance and also a help for you in the world of CMMC. It's a dizzying world with everybody telling you that there's some sort of elixir out there for you. Richard Wakeman has become a great friend of mine. I consider him to be, in my opinion, the Jedi Master within Microsoft on all things CMMC and how to think about Microsoft and how to think about CMMC. I believe that he's been a sleuth in being able to actually put out great advice, and I'm going to highly foot stomp his blogs throughout today's conversation. And we're going to facilitate a number of discussions around some of the Microsoft service portfolio, some of their new service offerings, maybe how they're unique in the portfolio and how they bring things to market. Richard is the Senior Director of Aerospace and Defense for Azure Global at Microsoft. He's been with Microsoft since 2007, which in Microsoft terms, that's an extremely long time. I'm sure, Richard, it feels like you've been there your entire life. So it's without further ado, I just want to say that Richard has been assigned and specialized in the defense industrial base. He's a great person, a great resource for us and for you. And he is forever very endearing and giving of his time and his opinions on things. So Richard, welcome. I'm really looking forward to today's conversation.
Yeah, thank you for having me today.
That's wonderful. So what I was hoping to do, Richard, is I know that we've got a very nice relationship together, but and we talk with you and Microsoft in general quite a bit about why it's such a great partnership. But I'd like to go through three broad reasons why I think Microsoft's technology is interesting, if not powerful, if not the best in the world, and see if you can't expound on it. I know you have some slides, and we'll use that. So let's first start out talking about the infrastructure. I thought that's the best place to start, especially when we're talking about Microsoft. Can you help the audience understand exactly where Microsoft stands today with compliance, specifically for the U.S. government?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, in terms of looking at Microsoft, we're the most trusted and compliant cloud in the world. We have made significant investments, going back to the early introduction of our public multi-tenant clouds, et cetera. We were some of the first to implement, for example, the ISO standards that are across global, and of course, meeting the requirements across various different industries and, even data residency requirements in various different regional that span the globe. In particular, looking at the U.S. Government, we've made significant investments into making sure that we have clouds that meet those compliance requirements, especially around FedRAMP, where we have FedRAMP High now across all of our Azure clouds, as well as our government clouds for the productivity suite. We also meet the requirements around the Department of Defense with the Cloud Computing Security Requirements Guide, meeting, for example, data protection for controlled and classified information all the way up to an SRG impact level 5. Of course, paired together, many of these are not mutually exclusive. We also have protections in place, end-to-end encryption that include FIPS 140-2, and of course, the high bar, I'd say the higher watermark for compliance of controlled and classified information would be, looking at export control data, such as covered defense information, technical data, or, ITAR, EAR. So in terms of looking at how it's all pulled together, I have written a number of blogs that Carl mentioned. Probably the gold standard for the Microsoft cloud is this one in the center around understanding compliance between Microsoft 365 commercial versus GCC and GCC High. Of course, that also spans Azure as well. And ultimately, there's a whole series of blogs that I've released in the public sector community.
Yeah, you've been quite prolific, and I love it. To be honest with you, your blog on CUI was something that I probably reread once or twice a week, and I just think it's really amazing content, Richard. So, as we look at the multiple cloud offerings and to meet the U.S. government and Azure, can you explain why Azure has all of these multiple offerings, and what's the appropriate way to go about selecting this cloud and cloud enclaves and so forth?
Yeah, probably the most common question I get from customers, especially within the defense industrial base. I work almost exclusively with the DIB and FFRDCs, et cetera, that have these requirements for data protection of QE. The first question that comes up is, for me to be DFAR 7012 compliant, or if I need to be CMMC level 3 compliant, which cloud do I need? Do I need to go into the government cloud? And of course, one of the points of confusion that we've always had is the fact that we've got multiple different data enclaves. And as you can see here represented on this chart, there's a bunch of different enclaves that we built, and specifically for the US government. The way I like to describe it is to really peel back layers of the onion, do a little history lesson. So I was one of the very first architects that worked with, I was in Microsoft Consulting Services deploying cloud, really before we even have any of the branding that you know today. So back in the days of Live at EDU and the Business Productivity Online Suite, we began to venture into this public multi-tenant, in particular looking at the Productivity Suite. And as we evolved, that environment that we built for support of the Productivity Suite, now known as Office 365 and branded all up, Microsoft 365, is a global offering. And it enables, as I showed you in the previous slide, many of the different standards and regulations and compliance requirements that span the globe. We offer now the ability, for example, to have a multi-regional or multiple jurisdiction deployment for Microsoft 365. So that would include data residency, for example, in the US or across Five Eyes. You could have regions, what we call geos, that you could deploy to meet the requirements that are unique to the UK or Australia or Canada, et cetera, or any of the other 50 plus regions that we have for and across our public multi-tenant environment. Now, this did preclude early on the ability for us to meet the compliance requirements for the US government. So if we move forward a few years, and this is now about 8 years ago, we introduced the Government Community Cloud, which is essentially it's a geo-region of the public multi-tenant environment. And this all predates Azure, right? This is back whenever we were still just primarily the Productivity Suite. And this environment region for the government managed by US persons, of course, with those productivity workloads deployed only within continental United States and CONUS-based data centers. And that gave us an opportunity now to meet those requirements, especially around FISBA, became FedRAMP, as well as Criminal Justice Information System and IRS 1075, et cetera, that all have requirements for US persons. Now, along came, after GCC, what we now know as Azure, Infrastructure as a Service, Platform as a Service. And we took a number of the components that you would have as part of the Productivity Suite and pulled them out and made them their own capabilities, especially if you look at things like the directory services now known as Azure Active Directory, right? And some of the networking services and express route connectivity that we have for private circuits into Azure. They all fall into a fabric that's managed by Azure Commercial. And that would include global networks as well as, follow the sun support model for some of the products that are outside the productivity suite, like, for example, Azure Active Directory. This did have limitations, of course, for us to be able to meet that higher bar for compliance that was required specifically for the Department of Defense in support of the SRG Impact Level 5 environment. So we built a fully isolated environment, both physically and virtually isolated from the public multi-tenant environment, now branded Azure Government Infrastructure as a Service and Platform as a Service. We built this environment specifically to protect controlled and classified information and for example, ITAR contractual amendments, right? This is our first cloud that we were able to offer not just Impact Level 5, but an attestation for DFAR 7012 as well. Now, that also gave us a platform to begin delivering additional services. So we have the productivity suite for Office 365 built out on that IL5 control set and available for the Department of Defense. Now, there are requirements around SRG IL5 that really do prohibit anybody outside of the DoD from having access into that DoD environment. And this includes the Defense Industrial Base, as well as even some of the federal cabinet level agencies, FBI, DOJ, DHS, et cetera. So for us to have an environment to accommodate them, we did a twin copy of Office 365 DoD that's now branded GCC High. GCC High is where most of the Defense Industrial Base that have requirements for data handling of controlled and classified information reside. And this is, of course, in alignment with our contractual obligation to DFARS and to ITAR. There is oftentimes a lot of confusion over the branding, right? So if you look at GCC High, that's branding for software as a service. Azure Government would be more branding for, in the U.S. sovereign cloud, infrastructure as a service and platform as a service. But they're oftentimes interchangeable, not incorrect necessarily, because there are services in Azure Government that are branded GCC High. For example, Azure Active Directory in Azure Government is a fully isolated version of Azure Active Directory, CONUS-based, only managed by U.S. persons, et cetera, U.S. networks. And that's branded Azure Active Directory GCC High.
So I really appreciate this whole overview very much, Richard. And I can tell you that these slides, for me, help provide this visual that heretofore I didn't have about how the CUI relates to the operating environments and how these operating environments are critical to the compliance of the type of data you're dealing with. Giving all of that, I know it seems like a trivial question, but I find every single day that Defense Industrial Base customers of ours, prospects, even current customers, struggle with deciding which Microsoft cloud offering they will need for which CMMC level or NIST 800 171. Now, I know that's a big question. I receive it probably every day, maybe multiple times a day. Can you help with this idea of, is GCC High required? And, in as pithy of a way you can. And how does GCC High relate to GCC?
Mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely. Yeah, and if you look at this particular chart, I'll use that term U.S. sovereign cloud quite frequently. Whenever I say U.S. sovereign cloud, that is the right side of this chart, right? That's the pairing of Office 365 GCC High with Azure Government. Whereas if you look at GCC, it lives over and is paired with Azure Commercial. So it's part of our public multi-tenant environment. Now, if you want to distill it down, the big differentiation between GCC and GCC High is that contractual obligation for no foreign, right? So that is being able to do an amendment on your contract that would be for ITAR, export controlled data. And that, is inclusive. I would say my argument, if you read, for example, the CUI blog, goes into detail on how, for example, NIST 800 171 nor CMMC really differentiate between different categories of CUI, right? It's sort of lumped all together. Mm-hmm. And not all organizations, of course, have a requirement for covered defense information, such as ITAR data, technical data. And, then the question comes off, well, if I don't have ITAR, could I go into GCC? And the short answer is that's a decision. It's a risk decision that you would make because, if you're achieving that higher watermark for compliance to protect CUI and to have that competitive advantage of you being, as for example, a subcontractor in a big mission system, then they may expect that you would need to have full coverage of QE, not just some partial coverage, or you could have to have and demonstrate additional compensating controls that you would have to implement in commercial or GCC to demonstrate compliance. At the end of the day, it's a risk decision, right?
So Richard, this is a great place to have a more detailed understanding of the shared security model at Azure and how that shared cloud computing model factors into a client's security posture, and then how that extends to the compliance in the Microsoft cloud. Specifically, I know that you guys recently have introduced a compliance manager and so forth, and maybe we can talk through that. I think also that we add on top of that at Cybersheath a notion of a shared compliance model that adds on top of the shared security computing model. Maybe we can touch on that a little.
Absolutely. The way I like to rationalize this in terms of looking at what the scope of responsibility are is, and first and foremost, there's if you look at NIST 800-171A or even CMMC, there isn't a really well-defined definition of how you would demonstrate compliance if you're running your information systems in a CSP environment, like within the Microsoft cloud. So we've been working to really look at how we would define the program of reciprocity with for example, all the accreditations and certifications that we do that would maximize and ultimately be able to satisfy the requirements in what we'll call Microsoft scope of responsibility versus an organization shared scope of responsibility in order to close the gap and be 100% compliant, right? Now, if you look at how that distributes here, this is a particular chart that shows Microsoft responsibility, of course, is much larger if you're looking at it in terms of software as a service here, but you still have organizational responsibility to do things like configure access control and data protection policies, et cetera. Naturally, if you look at how that distributes across the various different services in the cloud, you have a much larger scope of responsibility, shared scope of responsibility for infrastructure as a service as compared to software as a service. And if you look at in particular for CMMC, let's say the CMMC level 3 with 130 practices, that naturally you would be able to demonstrate that Microsoft's scope of responsibility, for example, infrastructure as a service, would cover maybe 17% of those practices. Mm-hmm. That's assuming you're in a cloud native environment, right? If you go into a hybrid environment, the customer still has to document in their SSP what the physical security is, for example, in hybrid. But we would, of course, take care of that in a cloud environment. Then you got that cross section. Yes, go ahead.
No, it's wonderful, right? It's compared to coming from the premise-based only environment, it's a wonderful brand new way of thinking about how to both document your compliance responsibilities and how other people are assisting you in the cloud model with that. I just think when it comes to compliance, the cloud really can help facilitate a lot of understanding. Maybe we go into this whole discussion about data enclaves and how this CMMC acceleration program and the compliance manager services at Microsoft can help, and I think are super unique in the industry at being able to do this acceleration, this jumpstart, these things called blueprints and so forth that you have developed as a company are amazing at getting people clicked into compliance.
Yeah, there's been quite a bit of discussion around how data enclaves may be able to support the cybersecurity maturity model certification or even compliance with DFAR 7012. And many of the organizations that I've engaged with over the course of the last 5 or so years, since DFAR 7012 became a thing, they oftentimes would begin where their organization may be either, dark to cloud, meaning they're on premises, or they may already have a presence in the commercial cloud. And they're looking to get compliant by setting up a data enclave that they would host, for example, controlled unclassified information into. So if you look at this chart, be over towards the left-hand side of the equation, and this satisfied oftentimes very specific requirements that would be for, let's say, a program of record or a mission system that you would be operating, that you could control data egress within those data enclaves. And looking forward-looking, it could be that those data enclaves are hosted for example, for bringing your supply chain into and giving them a safe place that would be at probably a higher level CMMC certification than the underlying organization may be. Now, the challenge with this, though, and what I've found has been an evolving journey, if you will, with many of our customers, is that CMMC and system boundary and the scope for it really does traverse down to the desktop and the people, the processes that are applied, data protection processes, et cetera, where that may be that the people and the devices that they use themselves now fall within the scope of a CMMC assessment. So what does that mean in terms of a data enclave, right? It means that either A, you have a different user persona for every single data enclave, which gets really complex really fast and expensive, especially if you're swivel seating and you have to dual license people in multiple different enclaves, versus saying, okay, well, let's look at lifting the entire security posture of our organization, and even making sure that people and their personal data. Whenever I say personal data, I mean, for example, their Exchange mailbox and their OneDrive for business or the M Drive for data storage, or their SIP account that they use for doing Teams calls and meetings and all that. That those underlying capabilities are brought up to a level of compliance that would be met by and ultimately fall within scope of a CMMC assessment. So you move from the left to the right naturally, where you would say, okay, we're going to start migrating people, for example, into GCC High. What does that mean? We're actually taking, lifting, and shifting their entire mailbox and their file storage and their software and solutions that they use, and shifting it into the government cloud, into GCC High and Azure government. And then And then you find that distribution oftentimes would end up encompassing the entire organization, what I say, going all in.
Yeah, right.
And we've seen that as a precedent, quite frankly, especially for the large organizations that have a significant business with the Department of Defense. Or, it could be just going all in means a subsidiary of a larger company, that you can find that clean line of demarcation between those users and the whole rest of the user population. And you'd carve them off and move them all into GCC High, as opposed to trying to straddle with commercial or on-prem.
Yes, this is the part where I believe that many companies are really struggling with. And frankly, I think they've been serviced up with a lot of not great advice, where you find many people just believe resolutely they have to forklift upgrade everything to the GCC High environment. So I appreciate very much you going through that enclave discussion. So now we've been through the infrastructure, we've talked through how to think about the different operating environments of Azure. We talked through the enclaving capabilities. Now I think it's time to go through the acceleration program, the compliance manager, and how to think about that, Richard. So I think that this is, once you're on the platforms, this is how you really get it mechanized and you get the program running.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've written several blogs too. You can link in here. Find them either on my LinkedIn or, of course, on our tech community for public sector, where we post most of these CMMC blogs. The Microsoft CMMC acceleration program is an engineering effort that I lead, and it's a cross-company initiative. So don't think of it specifically as, the acceleration program is a product. It's actually a set of resources that are delivered by Microsoft in support of CMMC that span multiple different engineering organizations, right? So I personally am in Azure Global Engineering, which means that I have an affinity more for Azure Infrastructure as a Service and Platform as a Service. So you'll see us, our organization, delivering things like Azure Blueprints and Zero Trust reference architectures. We're working with our brethren over in the Office 365 side to do some of the initiatives like with the Compliance Manager, even working with Microsoft Enterprise Services for delivery of training for our partners and customers, et cetera. So it's a comprehensive set of resources. At the end of the day, our table stakes, and one thing that we've really, I shouldn't say struggled with, but it's taken quite a bit of discussion with the CMMC accreditation body, the AB, various industry groups, as well as the Department of Defense, to define and understand what our customers are able to inherit from our platform. As I mentioned before, there isn't a very clear definition of what that program of reciprocity is. Now, what we have rationalized and have been building the CMMC acceleration program around is saying that we know that we have at least that minimum requirement that DFAR 7012 calls out: the cloud service provider must be a FedRAMP moderate or equivalent. And we not only meet that requirement, we also go a step further. We have FedRAMP High now across all of Azure, as well as in all of our government clouds that include GCC and GCC High at FedRAMP High. That's paired together closely with the additional control set that's required by the Department of Defense with the SRG. So by way of example, you'll see that the SRG Impact Level 5 is available as part of the control set that we implement for the U.S. Sovereign Cloud, Azure Government, and Microsoft 365 GCC High. We also demonstrate compliance with things like the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, CSF, and various hosts of other things. And of course, the contractual obligation for DFAR 7012, in particular, looking at incident reporting with C through G that we can do in our government clouds. So that establishes that baseline that customers now can be able to inherit from.
It's wonderful. One of the tools that you've put together, the team at Microsoft has put together, that I thought has been really visually wonderful, is this Microsoft product placemat as it relates to CMMC, which helps people, I think, visualize how a security tool can have a great effect on compliance by mapping, or as you put it, placematting, the tool to what can be leveraged in the CMMC world. Maybe you can introduce the Microsoft product placemat to our audience here today, Richard?
Absolutely. Yeah, we're excited about this, and we're coming out in a preview here this month in November. And ultimately, what the product placemat is all the research that we've done. We've done crosswalks and mappings between NIST 853 and 80171, as well as, of course, the crosswalk into CMMC level 3, all the way up to level 5. And those are all represented here within this placemat. Now, the illustration is interactive, meaning you can be able to interact with this placemat. It appears like a periodic chart with each of the families of CMMC. And if you look at the default view with none of our products, just the default cloud enabled without additional products, that you'll see that we're approximately 17%. Now you can begin to layer in where we're focused with the CMMC acceleration program is is closing that scope for the shared responsibility where the customer must configure some capability in order to demonstrate compliance, right? So we like to close that gap by saying, okay, well, if you use various capabilities of our platform, such as a security suite, then it'll apply to X number of practices. It does still require you, for example, to procure those services and to deploy and configure them. And that's where reference architectures may come into play. But this illustration here shows you how each one of the practices would map into a set of capabilities that Microsoft provide. By way of example, if you were to just select Intune, which is our mobile device management, desktop management, endpoint manager capability, I mean, it impacts a significant number of practices.
I've done this exercise quite a few times. It's like a what-if analysis, and I find that the Intune, I think if I remember correctly, on CMMC level 3, it can affect, I think, almost 35+%. I think it was 38%, if I remember correct. Directly influence the compliance on just that tool set alone. If deployed properly, managed properly, it's really impressive. It's great visibility.
Yeah, and you may ask, well, how would Intune, why would an MDM solution impact access control requirements? That's where you can start drilling down into it, and you can learn that, well, for access control requirements, that if you're going to protect controlled unclassified information, that you need to make sure that only trusted devices can connect, right? So the primary service may be Azure Active Directory, where you go in and configure a conditional access policy. But then you would tie that into, for example, a device management requirement to say, if you're going to connect to, for example, email and to be able to download that email to a device, that device must be a trusted device, meaning it's managed by Intune and it has currently in policy to give you the green light to be able to connect and sync.
I agree 100%, Richard. I often tell people that, the difference between, in my mind, an MDM solution and a remote desktop management solution is an MDM solution can drive policy and can be smart about what you're doing and do automated functions to your solution. So it has an MDM solution in general, and Intune specifically, can be this amazing virtual tool to do many things. It's almost like a Swiss Army knife.
Yeah, and we also pair together with that customer implementation guidance. We'd like for this product placement over the course of time. I can't tell you it's perfect today. The CMMC as a level 3 is still provisional. They haven't even begun any assessments for it yet. So until we really gather data on how these environments will be assessed, it's difficult for us to make any claims out of this. So it's all pending there. Mm-hmm. But if you look at being the source of truth, there's certain things we're making investments in, for example, to do things like have Intune be able to lay down a reference architecture. Well, what is a reference architecture? In the case of like Windows 10, it could be that you have Intune lay down a STIG, right? Win10 STIG. Mm-hmm. And then you start to close that gap even further, impacting a whole lot of other practices as well. So, it all comes together holistically. I think of the placement as like level 200. Level 100 would be like our security reference architecture, which is you can just in one view you can see how all of our products, especially across the Microsoft 365 E5 suite, impact compliance, and they all do contribute to an extent to some practices in CMMC level 3. And the truth of the matter is, if you don't get an E5, a lot of those practices, you're going to have to go and have some solution to meet those requirements, regardless, whether it's an E5 from Microsoft or some variant E3 SKU plus additional, features, or you're going to have to go buy some third-party product that would be complementary. So there's a cost associated with it, regardless if you don't go with an E5. But this shows you everything into one holistic view. So they're like level 100, almost more of a sales tool, right? Versus the map is 200.
Exactly. And I think, one of the things that we're trying to do with you and the end client is a bit of demystification around the licensing, in so much as the client gets a fixed firm fee from us on the managed services side of the house, and we bring the licenses to the table required for CMMC. I think it's a beautiful, nice mix, and we kind of demystify their requirement to have to understand the licensing models and the licensing requirements and so forth. Yeah. Given that, I know that Microsoft has thousands, maybe tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of partners in the world. I know that we are special with you with regard to at least this DIB and CMMC compliance piece. But can you speak to some of your thoughts on your favorite parts of the Cybersheath Microsoft partnership?
Yeah, let me speak all up in terms of, especially if you look at the CMMC acceleration program, it is designed to be scaffolding for your organization to build offers for CMMC, to accelerate your ability to deliver solutions and reduce the cost that would ultimately transfer to your customers, et cetera. One thing that became really loud and clear, talking to especially a lot of the defense industrial based tier one prime contractors out there, is that they are looking to Microsoft for leadership in helping to secure their supply chain. Many of them, of course, they may ask for some assistance, especially in the programs of reciprocity. But the real bang for the buck would be having Microsoft and our network of partners be able to go and secure the tier three, small to medium sized companies of the world that have a larger lift to get to compliance with NIST 800-171 and with CMMC level 3 and above. With that in mind, we believe that working with managed service providers is the answer. So building our partner community to be prepared to, there's upwards of 20,000 plus organizations that would need to get CMMC level 3 and NIST 800-171 compliant in a short period of time. So just the ability to scale to that size market will require, partners like Cybersheath and one thing that we've really appreciated about our partnership with you is that you offer, as close to an end-to-end solution to take the scaffolding that we provide, right, as part of the CMMC acceleration program, building on top of that, and even offering everything from compliance consulting services to the managed services environment that you host, even to security operations center, et cetera. So it's a great opportunity to have full coverage of CMMC and, of course, future-proof into CMMC level 5 in the future.
It's exactly how we think about it, too. And we just think it's a wonderful partnership. I know this may be a bad analogy and maybe a little bit of a stretch of analogy, but not that long ago, I put in remodeled the bathroom in my house. I'm sure many of us can relate to that. Over time, you have to do that. And I became familiar with this system to make sure upstairs bathrooms fundamentally don't ever bust a pipe and actually spill water on their lower floors. It's a German system called a Schluter system. And I became so affectionate with that system that I would only find contractors that knew how to properly install it. First, A, understood it, and B, properly how to install it. It's kind of the way I think about Microsoft, a very high quality solution that needs somebody that understands the customer's unique needs and how to actually fundamentally install it and be able to manage and maintain it. And I think that that's a beautiful relationship. In addition, I think, I know and I know the audience knows that there's a tremendous amount of pressure right now for this NIST 800-171 upload to the supplier performance risk system, which Katie Arrington talked about on November 30th. And our workload has been commensurately immense, actually. So we really thank you for the scale that you bring to the table, and for the partnership that gives us the capability to actually scale with the customers during this immense period of time. Richard, I thank you for your time, for your, frankly, your servant way of approaching this space, the way that you go and educate and talk and allow people to understand through your knowledge, through the Microsoft portfolio, the value that you bring to the table. Thank you very much for today's conversation.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate the opportunity.
Richard, Carl, thank you both so much. I think we all learned a lot about the opportunities for technology to be a part of the CMMC solution, but obviously the people and the process side of that equation is required to make that technology effective. Now, let's take another quick break, and then I'll look forward to our final session, which I think is the most practical, hands-on, how-to CMMC session of the day.